Howdy peeps, your friendly neighborhood Monomachos here, speaking to you today on a lovely November 30th. Rather cold, but what do you expect? We're heading into winter. November day. So, anyway, the 30th, which I believe is St. Andrew's Day. Anyway, all those Andrews out there, many years. Anyway, last week I did a podcast on Zionism, its historical origins as well as its geopolitical implications vis-a-vis the present conflict in Gaza. I'd like to pick up where I left off, if you don't mind, uh, and talk about maybe the cultural implications and what is leading the United States to be a staunch ally to Israel in this particular conflict. I believe there are cultural reasons as well as theological ones. Well, first, a brief recap. As I said, Zionism began as a Protestant Christian heresy in the early 19th century and was only later picked up by Jewish people and only non-observant, secularized, and assimilated Jews, as it were. Even then, only over the strenuous objection of the observant Jews. That's because theologically speaking, Jews have tended to believe throughout history, at least the last 2,000 years, that the kingdom of Israel could only be established by the Messiah himself and not by any human man or group of individuals or ideological political program. Okay, so anyway, there's a joke that about the Zionists who established Israel that they didn't believe in God, but they believed that God gave them Palestine. That's kind of a play on this joke about German higher critics who were Christians. They said that they didn't believe in Jesus, but they believed the Jews killed him. Anyway, so we should note here that Protestantism, arose rather late in the day as far as Protestantism is concerned. If we take the year 1517 as the foundational year for for Protestantism, that's when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral, then we could say that for the first 400 years, Protestants did not believe in the Zionist program or any Zionist heresy. In fact, the views of Protestants as far as the Jews were concerned were no different from those of the Catholics or the Orthodox. Excuse me. That is to say, Jews were to be baptized. There was nobody who believed in a dual covenant theory for the first 400 years of Protestantism. Unfortunately, Zionism spread like wildfire among Protestants in the West, particularly in America, and a little bit less so in Great Britain. I believe that there are cultural reasons for this phenomenon, and that is what I'd like to speak about today. First of all, there were cultural affinities between the ancient Israelites and the founding American stock, especially the Puritans. They were both strangers in the lands in which they conquered. Their lands were already occupied by natives. Number three, both of the native populations were pagans. The Puritans in New England thought it was their duty to convert the Indians, and when they resisted, they thought that this was because they were savages who worshipped demons. Nor should we forget their respective backstories. Both Israelites and Americans had escaped persecution. The Israelites escaped from Egypt, slavery, whereas the Puritans left England because of religious persecution. They didn't like the Church of England, which they think was too popish. Anyway, the 19th century was the age of manifest destiny here in America, and many looked to the Old Testament stories of Joshua and the other judges for inspiration. Unfortunately, by the early 20th century, most Protestants had imbibed the religious dual covenant theory, first promulgated by Bishop Darby and then popularized by Cyrus Scofield. We talked about that last week. I said something earlier about its relative popularity in Great Britain. I'd like to expand on it for a little, if you will. In the 19th century, certain evangelical sects of Britain had embraced a birthright theology, specifically the theory that the Anglo-Saxons were descended from some of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. This, of course, was viewed positively by many British, as this was the time when their empire started expanding by leaps and bounds. Actually, the Northern Europeans, they believed, were part of the 10 tribes. The people of Denmark, the Scandinavians, were from the tribe of Dan, the Danites. As far as the British people, they were of the tribe of Ephraim, and their American cousins were of the tribe of Manasseh. The Mormons also believed in this, by the way, to an extent. We could quibble about the details. That's not the scope here. Okay, in God's eyes, the Anglo-Saxon people had not only the right, but the duty to conquer the less civilized populations. The so-called white man's burden, as Rudyard Kipling so eloquently put it. And it was the duty of the Anglo-Saxon nations to return the Jews to Palestine. Okay, there was a profound political confluence between America and Britain as well. After the American Civil War, British capital was finding its way into America. Our railroads were largely funded by said capital. Eventually, American millionaires became extremely wealthy, and being acutely aware of their nouveau riche status, sent several of their daughters to the UK, where they intermarried with the scions of British nobility, the so-called dollar princesses. When all was said and done, America and the British elites became tied at the hip, so to speak. In the past, I've talked about how Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, was the daughter of an American dollar princess, as was Winston Churchill. So was Lady Astor, his famous nemesis. She was a dollar princess, and she married Lord Astor. Forgive me, I don't remember her maiden name. Anyway, more importantly, Manifest Destiny became intertwined with Anglo-Israelism, at least on a subconscious level. Each country had its reasons for doing so. America wanted to continue its push across North America, and Great Britain wanted to consolidate its conquests in Africa and the subcontinent. And all during this time, the dual covenant heresy had taken hold. If American Zionism was the spiritual impetus for our own westward expansion, many Christian Zionists believed that it was imperative for the Jews to return to Palestine and ultimately to be baptized. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, a Jewish convert to Christianity, wanted to send Jewish converts to Palestine and even set up an Anglican diocese there, which was headed by a Jewish convert to Christianity. Of course, this was all in tandem with British interests in the Middle East. You can never forget those interests, can we? Anyway, that was all over 100 years ago. The question presently, as far as I see it, is why does the American body politic still see the Jewish conquest of Palestine with uncritical eyes? To my mind, I think there are two reasons. First, we cannot discuss the tenacity with which many evangelicals hold to the dual covenant heresy. Excuse me. Many of their eminences, such as John Hagee, have developed a sophisticated rationale for espousing it. That's the theological reason. The cultural reason, that's what I want to talk about. And the second is cultural. Many heritage Americans remember their ancestors' struggle for the conquest of the American continent, and it was a struggle. The idea that the Indians were peaceful victims is not borne out by history. They gave as good as they got. Stories of atrocities against American settlers were legion. Google the Fort Mims massacre, for instance. The average American had very real and justifiable fears of the indigenous peoples of the American continent. I personally have known people older than myself who had grandparents who knew people who were scalped or had their daughters kidnapped by Plains Indians. For them, this was in living memory, their living memory, not mine, but theirs. Okay, today, of course, we look upon the Indians in a more sympathetic light. In the end, they got the worst of it by far. There's no doubt about that. Still, when all is said and done, the conquest of America was a monumental event, and we viewed it with pride. That being said, because we can no longer do so, white guilt, I believe we have transferred the pride of our achievement to the Jews of Palestine, how they not only conquered the land against tremendous odds, but how they caused the desert to bloom. I remember as a young 8-year-old boy how the Israelis were able to beat back massive Arab armies on all sides in the Six-Day War. Then 6 years later, how they were able to replicate that feat during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Later, when I learned about the 1948 Jewish War for Independence, again, another instance in which a tiny Jewish population was able to beat back the combined armies of Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, I couldn't help but be impressed. For those of us who are of Greek descent, as yours truly, these victories were likewise reminiscent of episodes from our own history. And there was more than a little sympathy brought on by that among my people for the Israelis. Since we're talking about the cultural similarities between the Europeans and the Israelis, we also have to talk about the racial angle. Most Israelis, at least the Ashkenazi demographic that founded Israel, as well as fought in its early wars, that demographic is largely indistinguishable from your average European. As for the Palestinian natives, however, they were, how should I put it mildly, more distinguishable from us. And so the ancient, the old dynamic of white settlers versus red savages was being replicated in Palestine, at least as far as we viewed it. And this is the reason, the real reason, I believe that subconsciously the majority of Americans, whether religious or not, support Israel today. In part 3, I will talk about the darker side of Christian Zionism, how it is no friend to the Jews. And I'm not talking just theologically, but politically and civilizationally as well. Anyway, ciao, pax, let's try to love one another.